Hello. Good afternoon. I'm Ron Brownstein, a senior editor at The Atlantic. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of The Way Forward, a digital initiative hosted by The Atlantic in collaboration with Chatham House, Emerson Collective, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Emerson Collective is the majority owner of The Atlantic. In today's edition of this hour-long conversation, we'll explore the coronavirus's effect on our schools and our workplaces. As many of you can attest, the pandemic has revealed massive inequities in the way our society and economy function in education and in the workplace. In the last 6 weeks, an unprecedented 30 million Americans have filed unemployment claims. US GDP fell by 4.8% in the first quarter of 2020, the worst quarterly downturn since the Great Recession. And the downturn shows no sign of letting up. Everyone is bracing for breathtaking unemployment numbers in just a few days on Friday. Schools around the world have closed for the vast majority of children, with questions about whether they can open again even in September. The downturn, the school closings, the other disruptions have not been felt equally. Race, class, geography have in many cases determined whether children continue with education, whether people can work, whether families are safe or exposed. We're going to dive deep in these issues today with 4 speakers who have deep expertise in the area of the workforce and schools. But before we do, I do want to thank the Churchill Capital Corp, which has underwritten this event. And I want to remind you, our viewers, that we want you to be part of the conversation too, wherever you are. You can do that by typing your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. Keep your questions as short and on topic as possible, and be sure to tell us where you are watching from. So with that, let's go to our first guest. I want to welcome Wendy Kopp, who you all probably know as the founder and former CEO of Teach for America. Wendy is now CEO and co-founder of Teach for All. Wendy, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the pandemic, as you know, has done something almost unimaginable. The schools of more than 90% of the world's enrolled children have been closed, according to UNESCO. In the US alone, schools are closed for about 48 million children. Let's start with the US and then look more broadly. How successfully do you think schools are adapting and using online learning as an alternative to the classroom? Is this a lost spring for K-12 students in the US, or are there places that are making this work and providing valuable instruction?
Well, I think whether it's the US or around the world, honestly, I think the answer to that question has everything to do with where you are and your level. I mean, as you said earlier, this situation just magnifies the inequities of the world. And so the most disadvantaged kids, whether they're in the US or in other parts of the world, are the least likely to be in safe spaces, to have access to enough food, to have access even in some parts of the world to clean water, let alone, access to ongoing learning. I think what we're seeing, and I think this is true here in the US and around the world as well, is that one of the biggest differentiators is whether, as a student, you were in a situation where you had close relationships with your teachers and the others in your schools, and whether they were able to dive in and find ways to make sure that your basic needs were met and that you were engaged in learning. But that is hugely variable, I mean, all across our own country and all across the world.
Yeah, you are now, after working here in the US for many years, working with teachers and school systems all over the world. What are some of the best practices you've seen, whether in the US or elsewhere? Where are you seeing schools that are most effectively adapting to this unprecedented situation?
I mean, for the kids that we're working with all across the Teach for All network, the first step is to make sure that the kids are safe and that their families have access to basic needs. I mean, what we saw all over the world is our teachers just diving in to make sure that that was the case, and where not, I mean, to link them up with basic services, because when kids aren't safe and eating a meal a day, I mean, 400 million kids around the world aren't getting their daily meals that they were getting through schools. So that's one. And then the next step is figuring out, like, what is their access to technology. And we've seen just incredible examples. I mean, I think about the Teach for Pakistan teachers who did a huge survey of all of their students to try to understand who has one phone in the household, who
Yes.
has access to more technology than that. They went to mosques to distribute educational materials to the kids who didn't have access to phones. So I think what we're seeing around the world is, of course, your level of access to internet and to the devices you need to keep learning is one thing. And another thing is, do you have access to the kind of teachers who will go to those lengths to make sure that the diverse needs of their kids are met?
I'm going to come back to the children without access to the internet, but a lot of the questions that have come in already are all around the theme of what will this experience prompt more use of digital learning in the K-12 space going forward, even after schools reopen, whenever that may be. Does this change, one question, for example, does this crisis catalyze a change to cheaper and digital learning? What do you think? Are we going to see a lasting shift in the relative balance between in-classroom and online learning options?
You know, I was just on a call with Andreas Schleicher, who heads up kind of the international education part of the OECD. And he said, if we've learned anything in this crisis, it's that teaching is a relational business and not a transactional one. And I think, I mean, as a parent, I've seen that as, you know, I think we see it every day. No doubt everyone listening is seeing like how strong your relationships are in your school community has had so much to do with whether kids are staying engaged and feeling supported to continue learning online. So I think, no doubt, I mean, I think this situation has, you know, as my own kids, you know, school principal said, we'll never have another snow day. You know, I've all become more familiar with how to engage virtually, but I think we've also seen that there's just no substitute for the relational piece of this. And I think if anything, what we've seen, you know, so many people are asking about the technology and the tools, but really you know, you look across systems and see which systems have actually made the transfer to the new world. And it's where there was strong local leadership and the kind of teachers and education leaders at every level who were just ready to dive in, innovate, be creative, be adaptive and resourceful. So I think if anything will come out of this, I hope recognizing that, you know, to get where we need to be, we need to make all the more investment in the people part of the school.
Because I mean, I think a lot of people wonder the versions of the same question. When this is over, however we're defining that, do we just go back to normal, what we were doing the day before we shut the schools? Or do you think the educational experience is going to look different here and in other countries for young people on a lasting basis?
I think it needs to. I mean, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that we have not only, you know, a health emergency and an economic emergency, but a massive education emergency. I mean, you look at the long-term effects that came from the school shutdowns because of Ebola, you know, where we just saw massive school dropouts, huge loss of learning, you know, very disparate impact on girls who were more likely to be abused and forced into early marriage, et cetera, in that time. And I think we're going to all need to ask ourselves, I mean, just as we are on every front, like there are massive new challenges. I mean, think about the setbacks facing especially the most disadvantaged kids around the world. So all of us, I mean, such an imperative, like what new possibilities do we see that can enable us to just jump forward and accelerate progress so that we don't lose a whole generation of kids. And I think first and foremost among them is to ask ourselves, what should we be focusing on as we educate our kids? Like, what are the outcomes we're actually working towards? I mean, there's such a collective discussion, and we're seeing it all around the world right now around, you know, you realize how differently prepared kids are to make the most of this time, irrespective of the challenges they might face, and realize how important some of those quote soft skills are that enable kids to be adaptive and resilient, and to have the kind of self-motivation to make it through this. And clearly the world's more uncertain than ever. So if we're not preparing our kids basically with the kind of, I don't know, leadership skills to actually navigate uncertainty and solve these increasingly complex problems, there's no hope. So, I mean, if there's a time to rethink what we're working towards for kids, I think this is it. And I think we just have to be considering, I mean, as we allocate our resources, as we think about this going forward, we just need to be thinking about how do we address the long-term effects of this education crisis. And I think it's going to require much more investment again in the people side of the equation. And at the same time, one more possibility we're seeing is that, I mean, I've never seen educators work so urgently to learn from each other across borders. Of, well over, I mean, thousands of teachers in teaching without internet WhatsApp groups from all over the world, just sharing solutions and translating into their context.
You mentioned that you have the WhatsApp group of, I think, 1,500 teachers now who are teaching without the internet in different countries. We have a question from Ella that kind of touches on that, which asks, how can you level the playing field for those in rural counties in the US and those around the world without access to broadband or even access to computers? That now seems like a very sharp point of division.
It's a huge point of division. I mean, we're seeing teachers using, like even when there's one phone in the household, I mean, there are ways to get daily lessons to kids, et cetera. So there are ways to make it happen. There aren't ways to make it happen without very resourceful teachers. I think what we're seeing all around the world is how much people are using radio. I mean, there are dozens and dozens now of Teach for All, like teachers who have been enlisted by their governments to deliver lesson plans on the radio. And while that may seem like super rudimentary, I have to say some of them are seeing the positive effects. They're like, we'll never go back. We now have partnerships with all these government radio stations, and we're going to use them to reach rural kids, their families, to prevent absenteeism, et cetera. So, we've got to innovate and be resourceful and look for the sort of ways that we can leverage that going forth.
Have John who's watching in North Carolina asks a good question. A big part of education is social development. And I'm just wondering if in the teachers that you're working with around the world have thought about are there ways to support children's social development while they are isolated from other kids in this period and help them maintain and build social connections during this period? Have you seen any innovative ways to bring the kids themselves together, perhaps virtually?
Well, of course, for those of us who do have internet access, there's so much of that going on where you can do so much via Zoom, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, if you use that space to help build relationships, to hold the space for reflection. I think for the teachers all across our network, I mean, actually, the question of kids' social emotional kind of well-being right now has been number one. I mean, their lessons are so much about that. I mean, they're integrating that into every aspect of what they do, because it's just, I mean, we know from research, we know from our current experience that kids are facing so much more trauma, and there are many risks. So all of the adults around kids need to be focused on that.
Let me ask one more question from the audience, and I'm sure you are asked every day, which is this going to change the way we look at teachers? Anne asks, with the strain on parents who are trying to teach youngsters at home, might this prove a turning point in how we value teachers? A classroom might help, but many parents are realizing just how big a job it is. You can't go on social media without seeing parents saying, wow, this isn't easy. What do you think? Is this a turning point in how we will value public education and public school teachers?
I think we can make it one. Honestly, like if we are recognizing that we're going to have to do so much to come back to schools in a way that enables this generation of kids to thrive, we're going to have to ask ourselves how to do a lot of things differently than we have been doing them. And maybe the primary thing among them is how do we enlist and develop and reward the most incredible people to channel their energy toward education of the next generation.
Let me squeeze one more thought of you along those lines. You've worked with educational philanthropies really your whole career. What is your feeling about the role they can play both in this period and as we try to rebuild out of it?
Well, we're partnering with philanthropists all over the world and multilaterals, corporations, in the pursuit of, first of all, ensuring the continuity of learning now, and secondly, and hugely importantly, ensuring that schools restart better. And so I do think that many have the sort of foresight to understand that, yes, we need to address and strengthen the health infrastructure for sure. We need to think about the massive economic impacts, but we have to prioritize education alongside that. So there's much to be done and much going on for the world on that front.
Well, Wendy, thank you for all that you are doing, and thanks for taking a few minutes out to join us. We appreciate it today. Thank you. Okay, now we'll talk with Rachel Carlson, Rachel Carlson, who is the CEO and co-founder of Guild Education. Rachel, thank you for joining us this afternoon, I guess, where you are.
Thanks. I'm getting my video unhooked right now. There we go.
There you are. Hey, hello. You know, the coronavirus outbreak has thrown all of education off track, but it seems to have particularly threatened the future of higher education institutions. We're going to talk about what Guild is doing specifically, but let me ask you to start a couple of broader questions about the state of higher education. First, as you've seen, there's been a lot of debate this spring about whether online learning is a fair substitute for in-person classes. You can see some students and parents talking about refunds or from their institution. What have we learned about the quality of online learning, not only in the institutions that have focused on it before, but in others who try to dive into it in a rather rapid fashion this spring?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think you have to, in some ways, unpack what are you talking about when you talk about college versus learning? So can you have the college experience that the 18 to 22-year-old is hoping for in terms of the residential learning experience, the dorms, the football games, heck, the frat parties, right? That's incredibly complex in this time. And I think it's a fair conversation we're having. But it's worth a note to remind everyone that only 27% of college students today will ever step foot in a dorm. The other 73% of students were already learning either on commuter campuses where they left their job, they jumped on a public transportation environment or a car that they, hoped and shared with their family members. They jetted over to community college, they went to an hour and a half of classes, and then they headed back to their second job. For those students, they're sitting in the back of a lecture hall, and this new learning environment where they can be learning in a Zoom environment with more proximity to a professor, where they can take classes after they put their kids to bed, because we know 55% of learners today are parents. That's actually a better form of learning. So it kind of depends what you're comparing it to. So for many of us who had the pleasure of that residential campus experience, there is a real sense of loss. We need to figure out what that will look like this fall. But talking about college and learning as the same thing is complicated for the people who candidly need higher education most right now, which are the 30 million Americans who just lost their jobs.
Good distinction. They'll take that apart. First, what is your feeling about this fall? Should that for that roughly quarter of the student body that had that traditional experience, is that coming back in September? Should it be?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. I think it's going to be complicated, and we're seeing lots of schools make different decisions. I think we're also going to see some mergers of campuses who no longer can sustain a smaller student footprint with the same size administration. And so everyone for 10 years has been saying, when will the great college merger happen? And I think this might be the catalyst for that, but preserving the campus experience for that quarter of the demographic who want it is hopefully something that we can bounce back from at the right time once the health and safety security issues are taken care of.
Explain us, I want you to explain your model, what Guild has done, and whether this crisis and the mass unemployment that has resulted from it give you any concern about whether focusing on employers as the means of funding some of this expanded post-secondary education is the right way to go.
Sure. So at Guild, we help the 88 million Americans, which is more than half of the workforce, and now way more than half the workforce with the 30 million who just lost their jobs, figure out how to advance their education and career while on the job in partnership with their companies. You highlighted that the companies are helpful funders, and that's true, but that's not the only role they play. And in fact, we'd be delighted if the government played a larger role in helping workers pay for their education. That just hasn't been the case. Where we think the employer sector can be quite helpful, regardless of funding, though, is in playing an important guiding and signaling power about helping workers understand what the future of work looks like, whether that's within their company or beyond their company. And so to give examples, we have programs with companies like Chipotle and Walmart who help their frontline workforce understand what moving into middle-class jobs in those companies look like, whether that's running a restaurant or moving into the supply chain or the technology team at an e-commerce organization within Walmart. There's also organizations like Lowe's who've helped their cashiers actually leave the business, but become skilled tradespeople. So go back to school to become electricians and carpenters and plumbers. And they won't work for Lowe's eventually, but the ROI and business case is there for Lowe's because the communities so desperately need more plumbers and electricians to install the kinds of things you buy at a Lowe's. And so I think the employers can play a crucial role regardless of the funding. We are still seeing huge appetite from companies to fund, but most importantly, they better understand what the jobs of the future look like. And that's what workers are dying to figure out in this time of deep economic uncertainty.
If we're looking at elevated unemployment potentially for a while, I mean, the CBO has the number staying high through 2021, what is the best way to help many of those out of work use that time most productively to enhance their skills and put them on a better track going forward? Are there ways specifically to reach those who have been thrown out of work by this crisis?
Yeah, so we've been doing a tremendous amount of work with nonprofit organizations, other tech companies, and then hiring partners, the employers that are capable of hiring, as well as those who are having to run layoffs and furloughs right now, to think about what would be the ethical outplacement or ethical upskilling initiative for this crisis. Because prior to COVID, we knew that there were 88 million Americans who needed to reskill or upskill before they retired. And America didn't really have a plan for that. So companies were putting it together in different schools, and it was kind of a decentralized plan. This crisis might be the opportunity to finally say, what are we going to do for these workers? And we can start with the 30 million who tragically just lost their jobs. And so we're announcing things in the coming weeks with these organizations that think about how do you help workers have short-term certificates and programs that help get them back to work as quick as possible, but in middle skilled and high demand jobs, rather than putting them back into whatever role they were in that might not be a job of the future or might already have been on the extinction path due to automation or technology that's coming down the pike in the next 3 to 5 years. So doing a lot of work on that. But to answer your question succinctly, it's short-term certificates and programs that stack into other programs. So we're not telling anyone that the college degree is a door that is shut to them, but we're starting with what are those short-term credentials and certificates that will launch you into a job of the future. And then you can stack that learning as you continue as a lifelong learner.
And I would note that even before this, obviously, in some of the community colleges that were having enormous problems with completion, we're trying to move toward that short-term certificate model so that people have something for their time rather than just kind of a year and never finishing the degree. Let me ask many versions of the same question we talked about kind of at the outset. Jonathan from Edmonton, Canada. Some students are clearly having a better quality emergency remote delivery experience than others. Is there a backlash that is inevitable in the medium or long run against online learning, given the variation in quality that people are experiencing?
On one dimension, probably. I think that's going to be most intense in the younger years, the kindergarten through third grade, and God bless the teachers who are trying to figure out how to do the kind of social, emotional, and behavioral curriculum that is a kindergarten classroom online. And my sister-in-law is a pre-K teacher, and boy, are the stories harrowing of what she's trying to figure out right now. I think as it relates to working adult learners, I think online learning has significant upsides, as we've talked about. When I talk to our students, this is a much more intimate and dynamic environment for them to learn than a large lecture hall that required them to figure out how to get to the campus and how to get a babysitter while they went to school. So I think it really depends what population you're talking about. And I think we're going to keep improving, right? This has been a surprise opportunity for all of us to learn online, but the schools that have been doing this for a decade are seeing tremendous student satisfaction, as they always have. And those are schools like Southern New Hampshire University, Purdue Global, Brandman, et cetera.
Right. I mean, and maybe the challenge is more places that have not emphasized this, trying to leap into it more quickly, right? I mean, that's particularly those that may have very high tuition points, and suddenly you're not in a lecture hall at elite global university, you're in front of your laptop, in your parents, in your whole bedroom from high school. Now, this question may also lead to answers that are differential for the younger versus older students. But one of our viewers asked, with lots of schools moving away from letter grades and toward pass-fail systems, how do we ensure students are meeting standards or even able to demonstrate exceptional work? Is that a relevant question for the adult learners as well, or is that primarily something that's more focused for the younger?
Yeah, I think that's relevant it's actually back to your point. It's relevant to the schools that weren't prepared for an online learning environment. So the best online learning in the country is actually highly personalized, way more than a lecture hall ever could be. I went to Stanford, I sat in a lecture hall, and the professor was, probably a Nobel Prize winner, but didn't know what I was learning or absorbing. An online competency-based model can dynamically adjust the next question you get or the next problem you tackle based on how you did on the last problem. And we have plenty of schools who are doing that type of learning today. Now, was anyone able to spin that up in the last 8 weeks with COVID if they weren't previously doing it? No. And so there's going to be some winners and some losers here in terms of which schools were preparing for a personalized online learning environment, in which case you can keep having competency-based and rigorous assessment models versus needing to default to pass-fail.
How big, you talk about how much debt that you have really preempted to save people from accumulating. How big a barrier is cost to adults upskilling during their career?
It's massive. And I think one of the things that happens too often in, I'll call it the chattering class, whether that's Washington or the elite environments that many folks talk about higher ed in, is people say, oh, it's only $2,000 or it's only $4,000 to go to that community college. Well, up until this point, the average American had $400 in their checking and savings account. And that was pre-COVID. And we know that that's now depleted pretty substantially. So telling someone to take their emergency savings account, which was for a health crisis or for when the car broke down, and telling them to spend only $2,000 to go back to school, it is incredibly problematic. And so we've seen that when employers take that funding requirement off the table is when you see just tremendous engagement from low and middle income workers heading back to school to upskill.
Let me ask you a very practical question from Mishi, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in Boston. What do you predict will be the most highly in-demand skills post-COVID, and where can workers who have been laid off or in furlough find the most effective upskilling programs for those skills right now? We have seen in many respects that the jobs that are the most essential to keeping the economy running are those that the economy is treated as the most disposable. And before all of this started, what do you think people are going to be looking for coming out, and where can people go to help prepare themselves for that?
Yeah, so I think, there's the jobs that everyone talks about, right? Plumbing, electrical, nursing, healthcare aren't going anywhere, but there's also people management, complex problem solving, process management, supply chain, right? Supply chain is part of this whole challenge and the whole opportunity that's going to get us out of this crisis. And so we spend a lot of time working with students to help them understand how the competencies they might have gained from, say, a retail job, a hospitality role, you name it, actually translate into those jobs of the future. The data is available, and we hope that every school in the country is really taking a pause to think about that, because the last thing we should do is guide students into low quality, low demand degrees at this time of deep financial and economic insecurity.
Let me ask you real quickly a policy question. After some considerably more expensive proposals were discussed during the Democratic Party primary, Joe Biden is going to be running in the general election on a plan for free public 4-year college tuition for families at $125K or below, and the cancellation of student debt for families in that same income bracket who attended public colleges or universities or community college. What do you think of those ideas? How big a dent could they make in broadening the circle of people who feel that they can afford to upskill, and could there be unanticipated consequences?
So I agree with many of those proposals, but I hope we don't make some of the mistakes that happened in 08, 09. And I had the pleasure of being on the Obama campaign and a firm advocate for most of the work we did there. But it is dangerous when you only endorse one corner of a sector. And so only endorsing the public nonprofits and not the private nonprofits, many of whom are great providers of not only liberal arts curriculums, but also non-traditional programs, as well as great upskilling opportunities. I mean, think about all the private schools that we're reading about in the paper right now that are at risk of going out of business. I think we need to think with a marketplace lens on and really focus on the quality of the institution and not whether it's funded by a state and a state school versus a private nonprofit. And so that's probably the thing I have the most concern about. I think more broadly, a lot of good could be done from that opportunity in that situation. I just hope the policymakers and the Democratic Party pause for a second and think about market manipulation before they only endorse one corner of the higher ed market versus thinking about the private nonprofit schools as well.
Well, Rachel, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you very much for taking some time this morning.
Thanks, Ron. This is great.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Now let's turn to Saadia Zahidi. She's the managing director at the New Economy and Society at the World Economic Forum. She's also the author of 50 Million Rising, about women entering the workforce in the Muslim world. Saadia?
Hi, Ron.
Hey, there you are. Hey, good morning. Good afternoon. So, we're kind of marching through. We started with K-12, and we took our audience into young adults and learners in post-secondary. But now we're in the workplace with you, and obviously this is a huge impact across the workforce, really in almost every country in the world, but very different impacts for different kind of workers. You briskly summarized the differences in a recent piece. Can you start by talking about the ways this has changed things for different classes or groups of workers?
Sure. First off, let me try to offer a bit of a sort of global perspective, right?
Yeah.
There's just over 3 billion people in the world's adult workforce. Of them, 81% are affected by a partial or complete lockdown. That is,
Wow.
Basically the vast majority of working adults around the world. And the ILO predicts that about half of them are at risk of permanently losing their livelihoods. And so I think that's the magnitude of the shift and the change and the challenge that we're talking about here. Of course, it depends very much on how we manage the sequencing of the health and the economic response.
Can I jump in real quick there and ask you, just to get a
Sure.
sense of that magnitude? Do we have any idea how that compares to the Depression in the 1930s? Is this a bigger global impact and disruption of working?
So I think in terms of workers, there isn't good enough data, but
Okay.
I think if you compare the size of the economic losses at that time and this time, a lot of economists are predicting that it's going to be of an equivalent, if not worse
Wow.
magnitude, especially if you look at the US economy and for where we do have somewhat comparable data. Now, in terms of what this means specifically for different workers, I think overall what it means is that all of the speculation that we've been having about, the future of work has actually arrived for most workers. One, for the white collar workforce, we're talking about remote work actually now being a reality. And it happened very quickly after many years of sort of a hesitation to put that in place. It's actually happened very, very quickly. And by and large, for a fairly well-skilled white collar workforce, it's tending to work. The second element is for a lot of service workers and for a lot of blue collar workers, this is actually a very worrying glimpse into a future in which machines do displace people in some form or the other, because the predictions from everybody right now is we are likely to see an acceleration of the automation and digitalization of the workplace. And there's a number of reasons why that's going to get accelerated given everything that we've just seen with the current health crisis. The third element is for those that are in the care economy and the health sector and the education sector, as we've just discussed with the other two speakers, this has led to this long overdue revaluation of the work that those people do. And that is an important element, and I think can be turned into an opportunity to create a little bit of upward wage pressure, improve the quality in those roles, really think about revaluing those roles. And then finally, fourth, for this sort of informal and kind of gig economy, I think it's exposed the fundamental lack of social protection that has been eroded away in most advanced economies in particular, and didn't exist to begin with in a lot of developing economies. That has just become extremely clear to everybody.
You used the phrase in your piece that that I kind of started with, which is there is an opportunity to build back better, not just kind of restore the status quo ante of where we were. Maybe thinking about those different tranches of workers that you laid out, what are some of the most important ways we could build back better? And is that going to be possible at a moment when economies and governments are still going to be, reeling and potentially underfunded for quite some time?
So I think there is this moment of huge influx of funding currently going in, a lot of extraordinary fiscal policy measures that are being put in place to either get funding directly to specific workers or to households or to specific SMEs or major industries, and essentially try to maintain the link between workers and employers. And that's basically what a lot of these efforts are dedicated towards. As a second wave of support and stimulus needs to go into these measures, there's an opportunity to either build in some conditionalities or really invest truly in some of the specific areas that can help build back better. And I'll just give like a very quick overview of sort of the few points that we're thinking are the right way to do that. One, doubling down on the upskilling and reskilling. And I think your previous two speakers have said that is a given. But for most economies, even some of the most advanced economies, the Nordics, the Scandinavian countries, a lot of European economies that have tended to still support this agenda, the systems are not in place to do that at scale. And that's what we're going to need to address. The second element is, sorry, go ahead.
No, go finish. Second element.
The second element is sort of identifying the jobs of tomorrow. We put out a piece in January at our annual meeting in Davos that was very focused on what might those jobs of tomorrow look like. And, we predicted that it's sort of the care professions, it's a lot of focus on technology, it's really specialized sales, and obviously it's the green economy. I think largely those four elements still stand, but there's going to be new opportunities within those. There's going to be a slight sort of changes, perhaps longer term structural shifts in a lot of economies, but still focusing on those areas will make a lot of sense, and helping workers understand what those are is going to be critical. Prioritizing redeployment and reemployment. Now, again, in a lot of economies, the structures that help people do either the short-term rapid redeployment or the longer-term support through active labor market policies, in a lot of economies, that system has just eroded away, and that needs to be rebuilt. And then, of course, there's, let's revalue the essential work that has just suddenly been exposed to all of us as being critical to how our economies and societies function. We're going to have to revalue that. And I don't see a system where we go back and suddenly start devaluing the work of those workers again.
I want to come back to that in a moment, but let me ask you, Andrew Chen a question. Do you expect the wealth gap to increase or decrease post-recovery? And if increase, how can we avoid that?
I think it depends very much on what kinds of conditionalities and systems governments are putting in place right now. If for some economies, is a very deliberate effort going on. For example, in Denmark, support is not going to companies that use tax havens, or at least tax havens outside of outside of Europe. France is following something similar. There's a lot of conditionalities in place, including in the US, which are giving support to companies on the condition that they will not be doing any significant layoffs in the near future. So I think it depends very much on governments to shape what kind of post-pandemic recovery and economy we want. And of course, there are other parts of the world where this is highlighting the inequalities, where support and loans are going to larger companies, not necessarily going to the smaller ones, where the effort required in applying for that support is so large that most small companies cannot afford it. So I think it depends on how easy and agile we make this system. But that said, I think it's not just about those conditionalities, right? Here's this opportunity that none of us were expecting to build back a different kind of economy. And that means investing more in the green economy, investing more in certain parts of the workforce that have been underinvested, but we now know care, healthcare, education, all of this matters and is a huge employer of people. So I think there are ways to correct those inequalities if we are proactive in those investments and if we build in the right kind of conditionalities in the short term.
You've mentioned several times the point, as I phrase it, that the workers that we've seen to be the most essential in these economies have been treated as the most disposable before this, with very low benefits, very low compensation, low benefits, little job security. Are you optimistic that this wrenching experience really all across the globe and the way we are relying on some of these low paid, workforces will change the debate about what is the floor of security and compensation that every worker deserves? Do you think that is going to happen, or what would be required for that debate to change?
I think that is what we need to all come together to make happen. And that is what a number of international organizations are calling for. And that is absolutely the right way to go, because you've seen an erosion of that basic social protection floor in a number of developed economies. And you're basically seeing a situation where that floor was not created to begin with in a lot of developing economies. And the sense was, we're going to use the sort of manufacturing-based development model, and that's going to eventually lift all boats for everybody. Neither of those things can continue the way we've been imagining them to be. So we have to put in place something more proactive. But I think it's not simply a matter of, there has to be a lot of government support provided into that, but there are also commercial or semi-commercial solutions that can help deliver that kind of support, whether it's on education, on healthcare, but it requires sort of building that in a way that doesn't end up creating greater inequality.
Question from several people, Vasuki, Jack, different versions of it. Do we need, and do you see us moving toward in the US and elsewhere, a universal basic income as a way of getting through this and getting through the prospect that employment will remain depressed and suppressed for some time? Is that an idea, Andrew Yang, if you're listening, that has come?
I think to some extent, we have ended up providing a form of temporary universal basic income to many, many parts of the workforce, or a promise of temporary universal basic income in many parts of the workforce in advanced economies. I think what we're likely to see a greater pressure towards is more universal basic services. And there's a sort of waking up and recognition that, for example, in the United Kingdom, if there has been a depletion of the support for the NHS, there's now a sort of resurgence of support for that kind of model. It's similar, broadly speaking, in Europe, a lot of support for having, or rather a view that we've been doing the right thing by providing basic healthcare services, and we need to double down on that. And this crisis has proven that. So I think there's a few other areas where the sort of essential nature of some of these services has become even more visible. And that's what we're likely to double down on, I think, as opposed to simply universal basic income.
Well, Sadia Zahidi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this morning. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, our final guest, our cleanup hitter, let's bring in Larry Summers. Summers is the former president of Harvard, serves on the board of directors of the Peterson Institute. He's also Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, director of the National Economic Council under President Obama. Larry, welcome.
Glad to be with you. Glad to be with you, Ron, and glad to be with all the great organizations, Emerson, Churchill, Peterson, Chatham House, that are sponsoring this terrific event.
Well, let's start with the question. I think many people in the U.S. in our audience, I'm sure, are asking, what is the key or the keys to getting the economy back on its feet and functioning again? What are the most important things that have to happen before that can happen?
There's one thing that's overwhelmingly more important than anything else, and that's getting this virus under control. You can have whatever fiscal or monetary policy you want. You can have an interest rate of -7%. If people are scared to go outside, they're scared to go out to the store, they're scared to be near each other, you're not going to have a decently functioning economy, no matter what fiscal and monetary policy you have. You need a strategy for getting to therapy or vaccine as rapidly as possible. That's at a Manhattan Project level, not at a regular biology kind of level. And we need to be doing aggressively some combination of masking, testing, and tracing. And we're unfortunately not doing that. So I think that the outlook for the next year and a half right now is pretty grim.
Yeah. What would it take to get to that level of testing? Is it something that can be handled in a decentralized manner that it's now largely unfolding, or does it need more of a kind of command and control central direction from the federal government?
It's much more command and control, because here's the problem. What you need to do is pursue every avenue, knowing that some of them will end up being wasteful. And nobody's going to start making a test if the rules are that there's only a 1 in 5 chance that their test is going to be the one that goes mass production. And in the event that it does go mass production, everybody's going to say it's criminal if they make a huge profit margin on it.
Mm.
In that decentralized standard market model, nobody's going to go for it. So what you need is some combination of guaranteeing people against losses, since the most likely thing, if you pursue the right redundancy strategy, is that there will be people whose thing won't get to the end. You need to insure them against those losses, or you need to ensure that there'll be politically and socially acceptable immense rewards for the people who succeed. I think the second is very hard because I don't think we want to pay huge profit margins once there is a successful test. So you need a central government approach to making it worthwhile for entrepreneurs to take that risk. And you can't get that from 50 states operating separately. So it's a very clear example of market failure, and it's why we fundamentally didn't outsource to the private sector the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
That's the kind of problem we have. And it was obvious then that you couldn't decentralize it and do it for the with the private sector. And unfortunately, we're not understanding that now.
I remember sitting in your office in the White House in 2009, and it is a way to point out that you had a front row seat at the process of digging out from the 2008 financial crash. When you look at that experience, how long do you think it's going to take before we feel that we are, quote, something like back to normal and the economy is working again? Are we talking about months? Are we talking about years before we feel as though we are back to where we were before this outbreak began?
Years. To start with, in that crisis, unemployment went from 5 to 10. In this crisis, unemployment's going to go from 3.5 to 15 or more. So it's more than twice as large a descent. We're going to have a major force making things hard for a year and a half at least, until we have a vaccine or therapy. And then we're going to have all the problems that economies have in restoring themselves to growth. So I would guess that it will not be that things will feel completely normal in the next presidential term. I think they will feel, with even modestly good luck, they will feel much better than they do right now 2 or 3 years from now. They'll probably feel better than they do right now in 18 months. But this is going to define the economic policy debate. I think the most important way in which my thinking has changed, and there were some people who are ahead of me on this, but also some who's changed at the same time, is this is not like a big earthquake. Ben Bernanke suggested, and I doubt he'd make this suggestion today, that this was like some kind of big, immense snowstorm, that while it was there, screwed everything up, and then the snow cleared away and things returned to normal. I think the two facts that the virus is going to be with us for a long time, my guess is that we're in the bottom of the second or the top of the third inning with respect to our experience with the virus, and the fact that when you have large-scale unemployment, when you have substantial financial dislocations, when you have substantial building up of debt, those things take time to work off. I think it's going to be a long time.
Larry, real quick, I want to go to the audience questions, but are we looking at a level of economic damage in the US and around the world that will be comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s, or not that big?
I hope not. And with reasonable skill in combating the virus, and with reasonably sensible policies it should not be of quite that consequence in the industrial world, but that is not an irrelevant comparison in thinking about it. I think it is likely to be a significantly more damaging event in many senses than the 2008 financial crisis, but not all the way to the Great Depression. But I fear that the downside risks relative to that forecast may be greater than the upside possibilities.
Yeah. A question. Let me ask you a question from Ann Cormack submitted, going back to your first answer, talking about the need for kind of a federal unified approach. What about a pan-governmental approach to finding suitable tests and, most importantly, a vaccine? Seems to me no one government can manage this alone. Should governments work together? And what would that take?
Yes, and there are various scientific and biomedical cooperations. I think if we wait for governments to negotiate the cost sharing on some pan-governmental approach, it'll be months before we get started. I think as the United States, we should be spending money on developing the vaccine and developing the therapies, and thinking that if that benefits, there'll be a very large goodwill benefit from that. So I'm all for all forms of cooperation, but if we wait for the ideal of cooperation, we'll get started too slowly.
As I asked some of our previous speakers, I mean, one of the striking things about this entire experience is that many of the jobs that have been proven to be essential to the functioning of our economy were, before this all began, in some ways among the most disposable in our economy, with the lowest compensation, the least security, the most meager benefits. Do you think this is going to change the debate about what the floor is of compensation and security and benefits that every worker deserves? Do you think that's going to happen in the U.S., or is we're going to be in the same place we've always been in terms of things like raising the minimum wage or ensuring access to health care or paid sick leave?
I think this will accelerate the day when we raise the minimum wage. I think it will accelerate the time when family and medical leave comes. I think this will push us in the direction of more social protection. I think in the broadest sense, Ron, this is going to be the final nail in the coffin of the Reagan-Thatcher libertarian wave. I think that wave, which came in 1980, in many ways had crested some years ago and was receding. And I think this kind of demonstration that there are massive problems for all our security that we can't, as people, deal with alone, that our towns and cities can't deal with as people alone. I think that is going to change that libertarian ethos. And as it changes that libertarian ethos, it will ripple through our politics to lead to a much more generous approach to the people who do the hardest and, in many ways, most important work of our society. You know, when I was Treasury Secretary, I used to, every year in Washington, Veterans Day was a federal holiday, but it wasn't a school holiday, where my kids went to school, and it was when the parents could go visit the classes. And I would sit and watch what these teachers did all day. And I thought, God, they had a much, much harder job. Being alone in a room, having to hold the interest and stimulate 30, 12-year-olds, that was a much, much harder job than the job I had. And I think this is going to lead to some greater appreciation, and here's the crucial sentence, of people who do vital work for which there may not be a standard business model that makes it profitable, but is nonetheless the most vital work of our country.
Barbara Weber, one of our viewers, has a question that is really a follow-up on that. And I mentioned paid sick leave, minimum wage. She asked what policy proposals would reduce the worst consequences of economic inequality and avert the descent into poverty for millions of people. Which policies do you think is the most effective and politically feasible? And let me throw my own little addition on that. As you point out, this will extend into the next presidency. If a Democrat wins the presidency, the attitude of Republicans in Congress about massive stimulus spending, as you know, may change quite a bit. Is there a way, or should Democrats be thinking about ways to lock in future spending today while it's still in the interest of a Republican president to have it occur?
It may be that there are ways of doing that. I'm not sure we see the future clearly enough to legislate for the very long term in the next several months. Ron, look, I think I'd emphasize two things, but there are many. I'd emphasize turning unemployment insurance into employment insurance, having a much more generous, much more automatically triggered system for unemployment or employment insurance that's focused on giving people the transitional help they need, that integrates ideas like work sharing for people who can only work part-time, that integrates issues of training for people who are between jobs, and turning it into a much more positive springboard towards future employment. And the broad thing, and your previous guests all talked about this, and I know it's something that Churchill and Emerson are very much engaged around, and there should be public support for this, is investing in the human capital of our workforce with the same energy that we try to build up our nation's financial capital. You know, we have had for hundreds of years what I call the fuel tank model of education. The fuel tank model of education is when you're a kid, you go to school, maybe you go to junior high school, maybe you go to high school, then maybe you go to college, whatever, and then you leave school and you know a bunch of stuff, and then you work and gradually your knowledge becomes more obsolete and you sort of run out, and then you retire and then you're done. And that model is fundamentally wrong in a world that is changing much more rapidly than the world used to change. And we need models that provide for continuous education. Much of that is going to be the job of employers. More of that than in the past is going to depend upon the individual initiative of workers in terms of getting trained. There's going to be an important role for government. But if you ask what's the most fundamental change in education that's going to take place, education is going to stop being a thing you accumulate and then decumulate. It's going to be something you're going to need to be absorbing throughout your life. And that's not just for like people like you and me reading new books. That's going to be for everybody, no matter what they do.
Let me ask you one final thing. We've talked quite a bit about the 2008 crash, and here we are 12 years later with a global catastrophe. Again, two events that might have been considered once in a century floods happening within 12 years of each other. I'm wondering, do you think our intricately connected, our intensely networked world that we are now living in, is it more inherently vulnerable to these kinds of global disruptions? Are these kinds of shocks to the system perhaps something that are going to come more often in a world as tightly connected as we are now?
Well, I think one of the responses is going to be to make the world a little less tightly connected. We're going to see some moves towards deglobalization. I think there may be tendencies in exactly the direction you're describing, Ron, but I think one has to think about it carefully. Before there were jumbo jets, there were never any airline crashes that killed 300 people. But all things considered, the world is a much safer and more progressive place because there were large jets developed. And the fact that we probably are more prone to some of these accidents, I don't think counsels that we should go back to the old way, which is a way where people didn't live as long, you know, relative to the time you mentioned a generation ago. The chance that a child born on planet Earth will die before the age of 5 is only half of what it was one generation ago. I think we need to be very careful here about throwing out some very valuable things, even as we try to get things under control. So my view is we need a kind of managed global integration and managed for the benefit of everybody, not for the benefit of elites, rather than a kind of isolation and gradual isolation of different countries.
Well, Larry, as always, you have given us a lot to think about. Larry, thank you. Sadia Zahidi, thank you. Rachel Carlson, thank you. Wendy Kopp, thanks as well. Thanks again to our underwriter, the Churchill Capital Corp, for supporting this program. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ron Brownstein for The Atlantic, and we will see you all again next week. And thanks again, Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. Oops. Ron?
Yeah, Larry, thanks. That was great. I don't know if I can unmute, but that was